In this video we'll discuss two similar commands. One is fillet, the other is chamfer. We'll start with the fillet command. With the fillet command I can come up to the ribbon, and in the home part of the ribbon we have the fillet command is actually right here below trim. And when I click on fillet, we'll see on the command line that it says the current settings are mode equals trim and the radius equals 0. Select the first object or undo polyline radius trim multiple. In this case, if I just leave it the way it is, if I go to do a 0 radius fillet, let's say I picked the two lines that are at this corner, I pick one and then the other and nothing happens. And that's what should happen. A 0 radius fillet really closes up the corner. If I tried the same fillet over here on the right hand side and picked here and here, you can see it trimmed these two pieces. If I tried fillet again, it asked me to select the first object and the second. If I picked on the outside this time instead of in here, if I pick out here and out here, it does fillet with a 0 radius fillet, but it trimmed off the parts that I wanted to keep. So when I picked it incorrectly, I might have to then undo. So if I say undo, let's say that instead of a 0 radius fillet, I wanted a radius of 2 units. If I say fillet, it doesn't let me put the radius in here. A mistake that we commonly make when we first get started is I want a radius of 2, so I type it in here. And because it accepted it, didn't give me an error, I think that it's working. But now when I go to pick the two things, it does not at all do what I wanted. So let me undo that. If I say fillet, in order to get the radius to happen, you can see that on the command line we have undo polyline radius trim multiple. It's one of our options. To get an option to happen, we said we had to either type in the first letter of the option we wanted, in this case an R, and enter, or right click, and in the shortcut menu, one of the choices that came up along with the others that are inside the brackets is radius. When it says specify the fillet radius, if here I type in a 2 and enter, now I've set the radius to 2. If I pick this point and this one, it puts the radius on there. What if I wanted to do several fillet radiuses in the same command? Several fillets. I can click on fillet, right click, and say multiple. And now when it says to select the first object on the command line and the second object, first object, second object, first object, second object, etc., etc. If I'm done doing fillets of that size, I can hit enter because I'm done, and it goes back to the command line. Now if I say fillet again, I could right click and say radius and set the radius to something different. Let's say I set it to 4 units for this drawing. When I click on one object for the first object, one for the second, it put a larger fillet radius in there. I could do one more fillet on here, and I'm done. What if I wanted to change the size of this fillet over here? I could say fillet, pick one point and another, and you'll notice it put the new radius of 4 in where we had 2 before, but it did not automatically get rid of the old fillet that I'd put in earlier, the old arc. For that I'm going to have to say erase, select the object, and hit enter. The same thing would be true if I said fillet, right click, radius, and typed in a 0 at the command line, and hit enter, and then picked 2 lines. It squared it off, but it left the old fillet in there that I have to get rid of by hitting enter. Okay, let's say we go back to where we started without any of these fillets on here. And what if I used trim, and I used trim and used these as cutting edges, and hit enter, and trimmed off all of these pieces and formed something that I can turn into a polyline. We did this before. I'll try it again with modify, edit polyline. It says select polyline. I'll just pick any one piece. On the command line it says the object is not a polyline. Do you want to turn it into one? I'll say yes, and J for join, or right click and join and window it all in. When I hit enter, it tells me 5 segments were added to the polyline. I hit enter again because I'm done, and this is now a polyline. The point here is that if I say fillet, right click and set my radius to something, let's say I set it to 2.5 and hit enter, and then if I right click and say polyline, if I touch anywhere on the polyline, it does all of the corners with that radius if it can. If there are any that are so small that it would completely eliminate one of the lines, it just gives us a message that it can't do that one. So we've seen fillet, basic fillet, we've set the radius, we've used multiple, we've set it to 0, and we selected a polyline. There's one last thing I'll do. Let me undo to go back to where we were. So I've undone the drawing to get back to here. If I say fillet again and right click and say trim, it says enter trim mode option. Do you want to trim or no trim? By default it's set to trim, and that's the way we've been using it. But if I right click and say no trim, now when I go to put in a fillet, it fillets it. Actually, it didn't work that time. That's because our radius is still 0. I thought I set that. So if I say fillet, radius, and set it to 2.5, and then right click and say trim, and it's now set to no trim. So if I pick one line and the other line, it puts the fillet in there, but it didn't trim off the pieces like it normally would. Once you set it to no trim, it stays in that mode until you take it out of that mode. So let me go back and get to fillet, right click, trim. We have again no trim. I take that back. I did that backwards. I'm sorry. Trim, and I want to say trim again. Now when I go to put a fillet in, it gets rid of the excess objects there. If I go to use the chamfer command, we'll see that on the ribbon up here, underneath the fillet command, that arrow to the right of it gives us the option of going to chamfer. Chamfer works very much like the fillet command does, except that instead of putting an arc on it, it puts a straight line. In this case, if I set my current chamfer distance, mine is set to 0.5 and 0.5, if I select the first line and the second line, it put a 0.5 distance away from the intersection here, 0.5 distance away from the intersection here, and then drew a line and trimmed off the parts. Let's try that again and change the distance this time. Chamfer, right click, and I want to set the distance. Let's say I wanted to set the first distance to 1 and the second distance to 3 and hit enter. Now with it set to 1, the first chamfer distance set to 1, the second chamfer distance set to 3, if I pick this object first and this object second, it did a distance of 1 on the first object I selected, a distance of 3 on the second that I selected. So your distances can be equal or they can be unequal, as they are in this case. Again, if I were to get back into chamfer, right click and say distance, and say 0 for the first one, by default the second one will be the same as the first one if I hit enter, which I will. Now if I pick either one of these first, either one of them second, it put in a 0 distance chamfer, very much like a 0 distance radius on a fillet. I would need to erase. Another method of using chamfer is to right click, and instead of saying distance, I can say angle. If I say angle, it still wants to specify the length on the first line. I'm going to say chamfer, right click, and pick angle this time. And the angle, it first asked me to specify the chamfer length on the first line, and I'll type in a 3 and enter. Specify the chamfer angle. Let's say I say 10 degrees, just 10 and enter. If I pick this object first and this one second, it just put in a 10 degree chamfer with a distance of 3 units along the first line that I chose. As far as the polyline, that would work the same way as fillet did. With trim, you can have it trim or no trim. If you get into chamfer, right click and say method, it asks, do you want to use the distance method or the angle method? So if I've already set it up to the distances, I can right click and say distance. Now when I pick one object and the second, it put a 0 chamfer distance in there. Had I had it set to 1 and 3, it would have done exactly that. So it remembers what your last distances were and your last angle and first distance was. You can go back and forth simply.